Well, joining us now to unpack relations between the two states is Senior Analyst at Africa Practice, Vukani Mde. Vukani, thank you so much for joining us here on Beyond Markets. Now, of course, in very real terms, articulated there, Nigeria, South Africa, the two big drivers of the African growth story. Traditionally, quite patchy relations, you know, valleys and troughs, if you like. The realization here, the economic imperative being made for closer ties. Can they do it? Is there enough commitment both at a political level but also at a corporate and at a business level?
Yes, they can, Karima. Not only can they do it, they actually are already doing it. Whenever people speak of Nigeria-South Africa relation, I often get the notion that there is an overemphasis on the political relationships, which have often been cold. We can't escape that. But bubbling underneath the surface of that are economic and financial ties that have been going only one direction, and that direction has been up. Last year, trade between these two countries amounted to about 35 billion rand. Now, that's a five-fold increase from 10 years before in 2002. Now, obviously, it started off a very low base, but it is growing and is projected to do nothing else but grow over the next decade.
Now, of course, I think, you know, the presence of big South African players in the Nigerian market indicates that confidence. MTN, S.A, Miller, you know, quite a lot of Tiger brands, for example. Multi-choice. But there has been complaints from particularly the Nigerian side that the movement of Nigerians is quite restricted, that African states are not allowing people to move freely. There's a lot of bureaucratic red tape. But there's also the very real question around things like security, issues of fraud, corruption. How are you addressing, or how is one likely to address the question of the free movement, which is likely to speed up trade and economic relations, but also keep a very firm hand on the fact that you don't allow your country to be a repository of, you know, criminal behavior, particularly when it comes to large-scale, let's say, financial fraud. And these are obviously concerns both for Nigeria and countries like South Africa.
The first thing to note about the unequal nature of trade between these two countries is that in terms of the trade balance, looked at a straight-up trade balance situation, it's actually in favor of Nigeria. South Africa buys more from Nigeria than it sells to Nigeria. Now, obviously, if you look closer at that, that's probably because South Africa buys a lot of crude oil from Nigeria and exports to Nigeria are finished goods, processed goods, and services. And so it is unequal in favor of South Africa in that respect. Now, obviously, Nigeria has a structural disadvantage in this sense because its economy is very heavily skewed towards oil extraction, whereas South Africa has the continent's most diverse economy.
But it has a market. In fact, one analyst compared Nigeria-South Africa relations to US-China relations. Yes. US is large, it's powerful, but China has the volumes. Is that a fair comparison?
And China to the US, in the same way that Nigeria is to South Africa, is potentially the largest market on the continent, the largest consumer market, which explains why South African consumer goods and services companies like MTN, like your MultiChoice, are actually doing very well in Nigeria. So the structural nature of that relationship is decided in favor of South Africa.
Now, of course, we've made the case for the economic relationship. As you pointed out, politically that's a little bit more difficult. We've often had opposing views on how to deal with crises, both internally in both countries, particularly in Nigeria, but also approaches to conflicts in places like Mali and so on. President Jacob Zuma today called for the establishment of an African stabilization force, and of course this comes off the back of what happened in the Central African Republic. When we were chatting with leaders at the BRICS Summit, African leaders, you did get a sense that part of the reason why foreign troops can move so freely is the inability of African troops to hold the line and hold a common position. The call by President Zuma, is President Goodluck Jonathan going to be able to come on board? Is it something that will bind the two countries?
Well, Let's look at it broader than President Goodluck Jonathan. Is Nigeria as a state on board with the call for an African standby force? The answer is simple, it's yes. In fact, the call for an African standby force isn't a new one. It's as old as the AU. It's as old as 2002.
So why has it not been established, Vukani? And what is different
because Africa moves at a snail's pace. Because Africa has structural disadvantages when it comes to money. For instance, the troops, whether those troops are sufficiently trained and sufficiently equipped. Very few African states can actually contribute meaningfully to an African standby force, which brings us back again to these two powerhouses. It is probably only South Africa and Nigeria that could contribute significantly financially, militarily, logistically, and otherwise to an African standby force.
Now, of course, you can't disconnect the need for political stability to the question of enabling factors for economic growth. We saw the case being made for a stable situation that needs to obtain in Central Africa if that infrastructure rollout plan is meant to happen and connect the north and the south, and one can see the kind of economic and political case for why you need direct intervention. But historically, African countries have been divided into Francophone, Anglophone, Africa, and the presence of a country like France on the continent, very active, has military presences in all its former colonies, has been part of the reason why African states have been unable